Marcus Thompson leaned back in his worn leather chair, his fingers drumming anxiously on the surface of his cluttered desk. The faint hum of city traffic was the only sound that accompanied him in his small, dimly lit office. It wasn't much: bare walls with peeling paint, a couple of old file cabinets, and a desk cluttered with case notes. But to Marcus, it was home, a place where he could bring his fight for justice into the world, no matter how tough the battle. The file in front of him was thick, a stack of papers that seemed to weigh more than just the pages. Caleb Jenkins 5. The State of Maryland. The case was a difficult one that would test not only his skills as a lawyer, but his very understanding of the legal system he had sworn to uphold. The charges were simple: theft. A young African-American boy, Caleb Jenkins, was accused of stealing a diamond necklace from a wealthy white family, the Walters. The case was already the talk of the town, with every major news outlet picking up the story. Caleb's face had already been plastered all over the media, and the accusations were front-page news. There was no presumption of innocence, only guilt, painted by the media's biased portrayal of the teenager. Marcus sighed deeply, his hand resting on his forehead. The weight of this case was unlike any other. Caleb's future hung in the balance. If he lost, the boy would likely spend years behind bars. If he won, Marcus would face not only the ire of the system, but the wrath of those who stood to lose everything. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Hello, Rachel?" Marcus said, his voice calm but steady. "I'll take the case." Rachel Jenkins lived in a modest apartment on the outskirts of town. The building was old, with cracks running through the walls and paint peeling off the doorframes. But despite the worn-out exterior, the apartment felt warm. Caleb was sitting in the small living room, looking out the window, his face tense with worry. Rachel, a hard-working single mother, sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly together. "Thank you for coming," Rachel said, her voice tight with emotion. "I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't agreed to help." Marcus nodded, taking a seat across from them. He studied Caleb for a moment. The teenager looked no different from the many other young clients Marcus had represented over the years. He had the same look of fear in his eyes, the same mixture of hope and dread that only an innocent person facing an unjust system could carry. Caleb's voice trembled as he spoke. "I didn't do it, Mr. Thompson. I didn't steal that necklace. I swear." Marcus nodded, his voice calm and reassuring. "I believe you, Caleb, but we're going to have to prove that in court." Rachel looked at him with gratitude. "We just don't know how he ended up here, Marcus." Caleb was hired by the Walters family to clean their house that evening. He was there doing his job, nothing more. He left before anything went missing. But now, they're saying he stole from them. We don't even know how they came up with this accusation. Marcus turned his attention to Caleb, who had averted his gaze. He could sense the boy's unease. There was more to this story than what was being told, and he was determined to get to the truth. "Tell me exactly what happened that night," Marcus urged. Caleb took a deep breath before speaking. "I was cleaning in the Walters' living room. I finished my job, and Mrs. Walters told me to leave. I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything. I just left. And now they're saying I stole from them. I don't know why." Marcus studied Caleb's expression, his gut telling him the boy was telling the truth. But something was off. Something about the Walters' involvement in all of this didn't sit right with him. He made a note to visit the Walters mansion as soon as possible. Something about the case felt too clean, too perfect in its framing. The Walters mansion was a sprawling estate on the outskirts of town, an impressive house that spoke volumes about the wealth and power that its owners wielded. Marcus felt a deep sense of foreboding as he pulled up to the gate, his car's tires crunching against the gravel. He was here not only to gather evidence, but to uncover a deeper truth that, he suspected, lay buried beneath the Walters' flawless reputation. He approached the front door, where a butler named Richard greeted him with practiced politeness. "Mr. Thompson, it's a pleasure to have you here. Mrs. Walters is expecting you," Richard said, leading him through a hallway adorned with expensive art and antiques. Marcus nodded, but couldn't shake the sense of discomfort that washed over him. The Walters were the perfect example of power, privilege, and wealth. They didn't just live above the law, they created their own version of it. Mrs. Walters, a poised woman in her mid-40s, greeted him in the parlor. Her demeanor was cold, calculating, and polished. She was the very picture of wealth and influence. "Mr. Thompson, I trust you'll be thorough in your examination of the case," she said, her voice soft but firm. Marcus studied her for a moment, sensing the underlying tension. "I'm here to get to the truth, Mrs. Walters. I'm not interested in anything else." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure you understand, Mr. Thompson. This is a very serious matter for our family. A theft, particularly one that involves someone like Caleb Jenkins, can be very damaging to our reputation." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "You're concerned about your reputation?" She tilted her head, her smile tightening. "Of course. We've spent years building it. The community looks to us as an example of success." "I see," Marcus said, his tone flat. "And what about Caleb? Have you given any thought to his future?" Mrs. Walters' eyes flickered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "My concern is for the safety of our family and our property. Nothing more." Marcus turned to the housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Miller, who was present in the room. She had been cleaning the house the night Caleb was supposed to have stolen the necklace. "I'm sure you remember Caleb, Mrs. Miller?" Marcus asked, turning to the woman. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Miller replied, her hands wringing together nervously. "He was a quiet boy. I remember him cleaning the living room, but I didn't see him leave. He was gone before the necklace went missing, but, Marcus prompted. She hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Walters before speaking. "I'm not sure. It's all a bit confusing. I thought I saw someone in the hallway when I came to check on the security footage. But it wasn't Caleb." Marcus's instincts flared. He could feel the walls closing in, the sense that someone was hiding something, and that something wasn't Caleb. As the days passed, Marcus grew more convinced that Caleb was being framed. He spoke with Detective Michael Rojas, an old acquaintance who had worked with him on previous cases. Rojas, a seasoned African-American detective, was hesitant to speak out against the Walters' influence, but he admitted that the investigation had been rushed. There were holes in the case, Rojas confessed. The Walters are powerful. They have the media on their side. People don't question their word. But something doesn't feel right. Marcus pushed Rojas further, and they managed to gain access to the Walters security footage. What they uncovered shocked them both. The footage of Caleb near the scene of the alleged theft had been altered. It wasn't just tampered with, it had been fabricated. Caleb's image had been inserted into the video after the fact. Marcus's heart raced. This was bigger than just a theft. The Walters had framed Caleb, but the reasons behind it were far from clear. The trial began with all eyes on the courtroom. The media had descended like vultures, waiting to pick apart every piece of the case. The prosecution, led by the ambitious prosecutor Clifford Gibbons, was ruthless in his portrayal of Caleb. He painted the teenager as a common criminal, someone who didn't deserve the benefit of the doubt. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Gibbons began in his opening statement, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We have a young boy who's clearly looking for an easy way out. A boy from the wrong side of town who was given an opportunity, only to repay kindness with theft." Marcus watched the jury closely, his instincts telling him that the case was about more than just the necklace. It was about race, how a young black man was being painted as a criminal simply because of where he came from. "Caleb Jenkins doesn't need to be a part of this system," Marcus said, standing tall as he made his opening statement. "This case isn't just about what happened on that fateful night. It's about how, in a town like this, a young black boy can be presumed guilty before the facts are even known. And it's about a system that looks the other way when people like the Walters manipulate it to cover their own sins." The trial was already in full swing, and Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. The stakes were high. Caleb's life, his future, his entire existence depended on how this jury perceived the evidence, how they saw the facts, and how they navigated the racial prejudices that lurked just beneath the surface of the case. Every step Marcus took was a calculated move to expose the truth, but the system was fighting back in ways that were too familiar, too ingrained to ignore. The jury, composed entirely of white men and women, sat in silence, watching each piece of the puzzle unfold. Some appeared neutral, others tense, clearly affected by the tension in the courtroom. Marcus knew this was a place where emotions were manipulated and narratives shaped. And in a town like this, the narrative of a black teenager being accused of theft was already cast in stone. Prosecution's case: ruthless and unyielding. Clifford Gibbons, the prosecutor, took the floor after Marcus's opening statement, his eyes fixed on Caleb like a predator eyeing its prey. His voice was smooth, persuasive, and dripping with condescension. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Gibbons began, his voice oozing disdain as he glanced at Caleb, "we have a clear case of a young man who, despite being given the opportunity to rise above his circumstances, chose instead to steal from those who trusted him. The Walters family, upstanding members of this community, opened their home to Caleb Jenkins. And what did they get in return? Theft." His gaze sharpened. "Now, you might ask yourselves, why would a young boy from a place like Caleb Jenkins's commit such a crime? What would compel him to steal from a wealthy family when he had a chance at a better life? The answer is simple: greed, and the misguided belief that he could get away with it." The jury exchanged glances. Some nodded in agreement, while others seemed uncomfortable. Gibbons knew exactly what he was doing, playing to their biases, reinforcing the stereotype of the young, black thief who was out to rob those more fortunate. Marcus could feel the tension growing, could see the cracks forming in the wall of justice. Marcus stood up slowly, adjusting his suit jacket. The tension in the room was palpable, and every eye was on him. It wasn't just the jury he had to sway. It was everyone in that room. His every word, his every question, had to expose the cracks in the prosecution's narrative. He walked toward the witness stand, his gaze locked onto Mrs. Miller, the housekeeper who had testified earlier that she saw Caleb near the crime scene. "Mrs. Miller," Marcus began, his tone calm but firm, "you testified that you saw Caleb Jenkins in the hallway on the night of the theft. Is that correct?" "Yes," Mrs. Miller said, but there was a tremor in her voice. "And you're absolutely sure of that?" Marcus pressed, his eyes narrowing. "Because I have a copy of the security footage from that night, and it shows Caleb leaving the premises long before the alleged theft took place." There was a pause, and Mrs. Miller's face shifted, her confidence faltering. "Well, I might not have seen everything clearly. It was late, and the lighting in the hallway." Marcus cut her off gently. "So, what you're saying is that you're not sure of what you saw?" Mrs. Miller's voice wavered as she responded. "No, I suppose not." The courtroom was silent, the weight of her uncertainty hanging in the air. Marcus turned to face the jury, his expression serious. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you've just heard is a witness who cannot confidently say that Caleb Jenkins was even at the scene of the crime. And yet he is the one who is accused, a young black boy, whose future is being torn apart by the weight of assumptions and racial bias." The prosecutor leaped to his feet. "Objection! Counsel is making unfounded claims." The judge banged his gavel. "Sustained. Please stick to the facts, Mr. Thompson." But Marcus knew that the facts, as they stood, didn't tell the whole story. The truth was much deeper than the surface-level evidence. He couldn't just rely on the law to win this case. He had to expose the injustice beneath it. Marcus spent the following days in a whirlwind of investigation, trying to piece together the truth. He knew that Caleb's innocence was just the beginning of the story. There were deeper, darker forces at play here. The Walters family had far more to lose than just a diamond necklace, and they were willing to do anything to protect their wealth and reputation. His suspicions were confirmed when he spoke to Detective Rojas again, this time behind closed doors. "Marcus, I got a tip," Rojas said, his voice low and urgent. "Something's off about the Walters. I dug into their financials. These people are involved in some shady business. Money laundering, illegal investments, you name it. And I think they're using Caleb as a distraction, hoping no one will look too closely." Marcus's pulse quickened. This was bigger than he had imagined. The Walters weren't just wealthy. They were dangerous. "Is there any direct link between them and the theft?" Marcus asked. "Not yet," Rojas admitted. "But the Walters have a lot of influence. They control the media here. They've already shaped the narrative around Caleb's guilt. I don't know how far they'll go to cover up their tracks." Marcus clenched his fists. He knew this wasn't just about Caleb anymore. It was about exposing the corruption at the heart of the system. And to do that, he would have to risk everything. As the trial entered its final phase, Marcus prepared his last-ditch effort to expose the Walters family for what they truly were. He had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, digging up the pieces of the Walters' shady dealings and the way they had manipulated the justice system to cover their own tracks. On the stand, Marcus revealed the final piece of the puzzle: a witness, a former employee of the Walters family, who had been fired under mysterious circumstances. The witness, a man named Thomas Finch, had been part of an illegal operation run by the Walters, and he knew the truth about Caleb's innocence. "I'm here today because I can't stand by while an innocent kid is framed for something he didn't do," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "The Walters, they're involved in illegal activities. They framed Caleb because they needed to divert attention from their own crimes. They planted the necklace, and they used Caleb as their scapegoat." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Gasps of disbelief filled the room as Thomas continued, detailing the corruption he had witnessed firsthand. Marcus felt a surge of hope. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The truth was finally coming to light. But as the revelations came flooding in, the Walters family did everything in their power to maintain control. They tried to silence Thomas, tried to discredit him, but the damage had already been done. The walls of their empire were beginning to crumble. The jury deliberated for hours. Marcus could feel the weight of every moment, the pressure building as he waited for the verdict. He had done everything he could to expose the truth. Now, it was up to the jury to decide if they were willing to break the cycle of injustice. Finally, the jury returned. The room fell silent as the foreman stood up, holding the piece of paper that would determine Caleb's fate. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Caleb Jenkins, not guilty of all charges." Marcus breathed a sigh of relief, his heart pounding in his chest. Rachel burst into tears beside him, clutching Caleb as if she had just been given a second chance at life. Caleb's face, once full of fear, now radiated with a quiet sense of hope. He was free, but Marcus knew the fight wasn't over. Caleb's innocence was just one small victory in a much larger battle. The Walters family would not go down quietly. The corruption that ran through their veins would take more than just a trial to unravel. As the months passed, Marcus's life returned to a kind of normalcy, though he knew nothing would ever be the same. Caleb was free, but the real work was just beginning. Marcus had exposed the systemic corruption in the Walters family, but there was still so much left to do. In the quiet of his office, Marcus looked at the case file one last time. He knew there would be more cases like Caleb's, more battles against a system that was stacked against those who needed it most. But he was ready, because Marcus Thompson knew one thing for sure: the fight for justice was never easy. But it was always worth it.